Now, when the modelers predicted how many people would likely die in this country from the coronavirus, did they factor in what some are calling deaths of despair? Last month, April, 25 million Americans filing for unemployment. Are you kidding me? Consider this phone call I recently got from a woman on my radio show.
Hi, Larry. I was calling about the people who have called suicide hotline and different things with this loss of income. I am a widow of somebody who did commit suicide because of income. It was not now during the epidemic, but it was because of dwindling income and hopelessness, which he hid from me. I had no idea this was going on in his business life. And I came home from work one day and found him hanging in the garage. He did leave a note about the different debts and things like that, but financial problems are a horrible thing. It's just a horrible thing, worse than the virus. That's all I wanted to say. Bye.
And check out this Washington Post headline. Small business used to define America's economy. The pandemic could change that forever. More than 100,000 small businesses have closed forever as the nation's pandemic toll escalates, end of quote. Now, as you know, the president has been hammered for his response to the coronavirus pandemic. Critics have accused him of having blood on his hands. Some have even said the failure of the Senate to throw him out of office after the House duly impeached him is a primary cause for the deaths of so many Americans. For crying out loud. Have you gone to the CDC website and checked out what governors are supposed to do? Look at this. Governors' consideration during the preparedness phase of a pandemic. Stockpile equipment and supplies which may be in short supply, such as masks, ventilators, hand sanitizers, medications such as antivirals, and some antibiotics for pneumonia. I repeat, masks, ventilators, hand sanitizers. Now, for those of us libertarians who don't have a whole lot of confidence in the federal government's ability to do, frankly, virtually anything well, we're not surprised. Neither is this Professor Alex Tabarrok from George Mason University, who writes a very influential blog called The Marginal Revolution.
Yeah, I would say that the response of both the CDC and the Food and Drug Administration has been a failure of historic proportions. I've always been, skeptical of the FDA, but this failure is so extreme that it's really remarkable. I'm surprised that it's been so bad. Here's the basic issue. Look, China gave us a window of opportunity by locking down Wuhan, by having immense controls, by shutting down their economy. They took these tremendous actions weeks and weeks, months before we did. And that should have sent up a signal flare to everybody in the world. Take this seriously. I mean, I, as an economist, not an epidemiologist, not a microbiologist, I looked at what China was doing to their economy, and I knew this has got to be taken seriously because the Chinese aren't stupid. They're not going to be throwing away trillions of dollars and entirely locking down their economy for something which is, quote, like the flu. I mean, this is a very serious issue. And the whole job of the CDC, the whole reason we have the CDC is precisely to prepare for pandemics like this.
And here's what Senator Rand Paul said about experts like Dr. Fauci of the National Institutes of Health.
It's not to say this isn't deadly, but really outside of New England, we've had a relatively benign course for this virus nationwide. And I think the one size fits all that we're going to have a national strategy and nobody's going to go to school is kind of ridiculous. We really ought to be doing it school district by school district. And the power needs to be dispersed because people make wrong predictions. And really the history of this, when we look back, will be of wrong prediction after wrong prediction after wrong prediction, starting with Ferguson in England. So I think we ought to have a little bit of humility in our belief that we know what's best for the economy. And as much as I respect you, Dr. Fauci, I don't think you're the end all. I don't think you're the one person that gets to make a decision.
Now, in 2012, the federal government's National Center on biotechnology did a study on the link between unemployment and suicide. We examined the link between employment status and suicide risk using a panel of U.S. states from 1996 to 2005. Our results are consistent with unemployment duration being the dominant force in the relationship between job loss and suicide. End of quote. And then there's this study that says as many as 75,000 people could die as a result to our response to the coronavirus pandemic.
A new study is warning that the next health crisis triggered by COVID-19 may actually be a wave of suicides. The study warns that the isolation and the anxiety from the lockdown may be responsible for as many as 75,000 drug overdoses and suicides over the next decade.
During this shutdown, we're seeing people pulling up in nice cars. These are people who are middle-class people, sometimes even better, who have had a sudden reversal of fortune because of our response to the coronavirus pandemic.
Members of the National Guard are being deployed across the country to help states mitigate the other painful reality from the pandemic, hunger. Lines are stretching for miles in state after state as the millions of Americans now living on the edge are facing disruptions in the food distribution chain. The challenge is expected to get worse.
More families are struggling to afford basic necessities, and relief organizations are scrambling as well.
Thousands of families lined up again for food from the San Antonio Food Bank. A massive distribution was held at the Alamo Dome. Lines of cars went on for miles. The San Antonio Food Bank says people even spent the night in their cars to save their spot in line.
Thousands have been forced to wait for hours in long lines at food banks all across the country. Feeding America, the nation's largest network of food banks, reported a 98% increase in demand.
These are middle-class people who have had a sudden financial meltdown because of our response to the coronavirus. Now, for people who are poor, they're used to it maybe. People who are really, really rich, who've had a sudden reversal of fortune, some of them can't handle it.
Now, listen to me very carefully, please. You see, when you have capital, you are able to derive... No, but I will attend to the check in a moment, Mr. Graham. I understand about the check. I'm trying to explain something to you that is terribly important. When we spend more per month or per year than we have in income, you must then dip into the capital, eventually exhausting the capital and, of course, therefore, the income. Do you see what I mean?
Mr. Beckett, this check must be paid.
Mr. Graham,
And at once.
I'm trying to explain to you that it is impossible to pay the check because your expenses have exceeded your income to such a point that you have exhausted your capital. Now you have no capital, no income, therefore no funds for the check, you see.
Don't treat me as though I were a child, Mr. Beckett.
No, I'm not.
I am as aware of what it means to have no capital as you are.
Oh, good, good.
Now, what about this check?
Well, are you entirely sure that you really do understand what I mean by capital, Mr. Graham? You see, you've exhausted the capital. I can't cover the check because the check is for $6,000 and you don't have $6,000. In other words, you don't have $60.
Come to the point, Beckett.
The point, Mr. Graham, is that you don't have any money. The capital and the income are exhausted and you no longer have any money. I wish there was some other way I could say it. How could I put it? That money, you have no capital, you have no income, no, it's only money. No, you have no money. There's no other way to put it, you see.
You mean I have no money?
Yes, that's what I mean. You have no money.
Ouch. On a serious note, one of my favorite novels is Of Human Bondage. And there's a scene in the novel where the protagonist wants to be an artist, has taken art courses from a reputable professor, and summoned the courage to have the professor come by his place to look at his work. He didn't want to waste his time. He wanted to make sure that he had skills as an artist, so he summoned the courage to ask his professor to come and look at his work. Professor did, and said, "It's mediocre. If I were you, I would try to do something else with my life." And the protagonist of the book was crushed. But the professor then turned to him and gave him some advice. And here's what he said. "You have very little private means." "Very little," answered Philip. The professor responded, "There is nothing so degrading as the constant anxiety about one's means of livelihood. I have nothing but contempt for people who despise money. They are hypocrites or fools. Money is like a sixth sense, without which you cannot make a complete use of the other five. Without an adequate income, half the possibilities of life are shut off. The only thing to be careful about is that you do not pay more than a shilling for the shilling you earn. You will hear people say that poverty is the best spur to the artist. They have never felt the iron of it in their flesh. They do not know how mean it makes you. It exposes you to endless humiliation. It cuts your wings. It eats into your soul like a cancer. It is not wealth one asks for, but just enough to preserve one's dignity, to work unhampered, to be generous, frank, and independent. I pity with all my heart the artist, whether he writes or paints, who is entirely dependent for subsistence upon his art. End of quote. As I said, Philip, the protagonist in the book, was crushed. But the artist professor said to him, I only wish someone had given me the same advice when I was your age, and that I had taken it. Another one of my favorite quotes about money is this scene from Giant, starring Elizabeth Taylor and James Dean. Check this out.
Money isn't old, you know, Jim.
Not when you got it.
Finally, Supreme Court has been holding its hearings virtually because of the coronavirus. Sonia Sotomayor forgot that she was mic'd up when she took care of some personal business. Check this out.
Discussing and addressing the content of the calls at issue being made by collectors of government-backed debt, and it contemplates that the subject matter of the call might range beyond the collection of government-backed debt. Maybe they're going to be marketing some other product. Maybe they're going to be saying, hey, call your congressman and change these laws that apply to banks. And what the FCC has said is that when the subject matter of the call ranges to the topic, then the call is transformed. And it's a call that would.
Now recall Justice Sonia Sotomayor, before she became a justice, said, I would hope that a wise Latina, given the richness of her experiences, would reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't had those experiences. Well, apparently, this white male and Sonia Sotomayor had identical experiences.
Thank you, Lieutenant Drebin. Of course, we all have a stake in seeing that this portion of the Queen's American Goodwill Tour is completely successful. And we can all take pride that the Queen has chosen our sixth visit. Indeed, it is for all the people who will be able to share in the celebration, especially exciting, will be the Queen's.
So cheer up, Justice Sotomayor. Things could have been a lot worse. Now, I have this t-shirt on. Ta-da! Uncle Tom, my movie debuts June 19th. Check out this trailer. Most people are completely oblivious to the history of the Democratic Party.
The party of slavery.
The history of the Democratic Party.
Jim Crow laws.
They're erasing all of the history of this country.
They want to cover up history.
The real history, not the revisionist history.
If you are educated,
Black people have been taught
a narrative that has been created.
You're actually miseducated.
And that's when I realized I've been lied to.
I had been misled.
It unraveled everything that I knew to be true.
June 19th, UncleTom.com. Order your own t-shirt. Be the first on your hood. I'm Larry Elder, and we've got a country to save. I'll see you next time.